one hand, we know that the self help industry has become this dominating force in modern culture. And it promises, personal transformation and success and wellness. And it frames these things as like an easy, overnight, rapid transformation. And we can see how this is also reflected in the coaching industry, especially like the spiritual coaching industry. And then on the other hand, we know that people are struggling. Society is pretty sick. So the juxtaposition between what self help defines and expects wellness and success to look like versus the actual reality of where people are literally struggling to survive. It's such a like collective dissonance, cognitive dissonance on a mass level where we are being gaslit by an entire industry in a very mainstream way. And I've been reflecting on what effect is this having on our well being, on our individual well being, on our collective well being, on the well being of our relationships and our relationship with the divine. And once I started asking those questions and unpacking it, I went down a rabbit hole. And I have been in the rabbit hole for a while. Like it's taken me years to be able to, number one, see the forest for the trees, and number two, integrate it and embody it in a way that I can now like actually speak to it confidently. And I would say that unless you have been through it, you can't really deconstruct it, right? Because even if you have been through it, a certain amount of time needs to pass before you can actually, like I said, process and integrate everything. So it is so complex, it is so multi-layered, and I am finally really happy to be on the other side of it and come out crawl out of the rabbit hole. And I feel ready. I feel ready to talk about it. I'm ready to share and shed some light on why the self-help industry is so toxic and culty. um, Short answer is because the entire success of the self help industry hinges on its ability to tap into people's deepest insecurities and vulnerabilities, which is a form of exploitation. And this exploitation creates a very lucrative market for self-help products and services and these, self-proclaimed gurus to succeed. And the long answer, well, brace yourself, sit back, relax, and let's dive in. Welcome to Conscious Revolution, a podcast about political awakening. My name is Margaret Daftian, and I'm here to help you navigate a confusing world of misinformation, hidden agendas, AI, and cult dynamics. Because it's not enough to just evolve, we must also resist and challenge those destructive influences that distort our evolution. Get in, loser! We're starting a conscious revolution. Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Conscious Revolution. This is episode 16, The Cult of Self-Help. This is how the self-help industry doesn't help you. This is a solo episode because I have a lot to say about this topic. I have been waiting a long time to share my story, and I have been sharing my story over the last couple of years, but I've mostly been focusing on new age spirituality. And what was missing from this conversation is the toxic self help industry. Because in a lot of ways, this was the original mainstream cult that indoctrinated me into the new age cult. And then, even more niche from there, was the neo tantra cult, which was Osho. So, this episode is kind of like foundational, and it's long overdue, and we've skipped ahead a ton without really addressing the colossal elephant in the room, which is the self help industry. And even bigger than that is the wellness industry. But we're focusing on the self help industry, and I'm really excited about this episode. It's literally been brewing inside of me for over 2 years now, if not longer. So it's a very long time coming for me, and it kind of represents a turning point, like turning a new leaf in my work in this space, because I am going to focus a lot more on ethical self-help, which is a thing. It is possible to actually approach self-help in a way that does not play into these, commercialized interests of the global wellness industry, because obviously it doesn't have our best interest in mind. Anyway, I'm really compelled to talk about this because for the longest time I felt very alone in my struggles, my personal struggles within the self-help industry. Like, I felt really confused and disoriented about why these practices and these beliefs and etc. were not actually helping me. And it was very frustrating. And when I started to actually speak up about it and talk about it a few years ago, people started to chime in with their own experiences and reflecting that they had a similar bad time within this industry. And even now, like every time I share my story, inevitably people always say that they can relate, that my story helps them feel less alone, less crazy, more seen. And in turn, that helps me to feel more validated as well and less crazy, because I've been asking this question for a while. And I want to know, like, what is going on here? What is actually missing? If we deconstruct it, what are we going to find under the hood? Before we get started, I wanted to let you know, in case you missed the memo, that I just released my new ebook on demystifying self love, loving yourself beyond the trend. A lot of the topics that I discuss in this episode, I go much deeper into in my ebook. And the reason why I wrote this ebook on demystifying self love is because rather than focusing on the entire self help industry as a whole, I found that it's helpful to focus on these smaller trends, like the trend within the trend, right? Because they mirror a lot of the toxic elements of the industry as a whole. And because self-help and pop culture and these pop psych trends within the self-help industry have reoccurring themes, these themes often converge along a common thread that runs through various points in time. So whether we're looking at it now or 10 years from now or 10 years ago, that common thread is there. And when we find it and we follow it, we start to unravel a lot of those similar themes that come up. And this is why my story, even though, the details are different, people say that my story is relatable because of those similar themes that converge along this common thread. They tell a bigger story, and they tell a collective story that represents our collective struggle to find and define ourselves and our lives within these overlapping and overbearing industries that are constantly telling us, what it means to be successful and happy and self actualized. And self love is one of those bigger trends within the trend. And it is one of the biggest struggles of our generation. People don't love themselves. And I didn't for the longest time. I would say throughout my most of my adult life, I didn't even know what it means to love myself, what that looked like or what that felt like. And self love is a topic that is emphasized and overemphasized in the self help industry to make it seem like that's where you go to find the answers, right? And so I did do that. And I did immerse myself in self help literature and, became this self help junkie to where I was also self proclaimed self help teacher, right? And after a while of doing that, I realized that my life is not actually improving, that my mental health, my mental state was not actually improving. And even though I was doing all of these beliefs systems and adopting, mindset hacks and doing the affirmations and all this stuff that they tell you to do, and reading, consuming constantly so much self help literature, I wasn't getting better. I wasn't getting closer to that feeling of truly loving myself. And so that's kind of what led me. I mean, that's not the only thing that led me into New Age and the cult, but that's one of the major things, is because I was seeking a different way. I was seeking answers that were not available in the self help literature. I felt like there was a point that it stagnated. It was helpful up to a certain point, and then it became like it plateaued. And so I went on this big long search, and then I kind of fell into the other extreme end of it where I totally dissociated from myself. So if the self help literature made me like overly identify with myself and my ego and my identity, being deeply immersed in the, neo Advaita, neo Tantra kind of culture made me like completely dissociate from myself, to where I adopted a new identity. So obviously there was a balance there that needed to happen, and there was a gap, that needed to be bridged. And I'm really fortunate that I was able to bridge that gap through my own self study and, bringing in aspects of psychology in the academic sense, like transpersonal psychology and positive psychology and clinical psychology, and then also integrating non-dualism, the aspects of non-dualism and neo-advaita that were actually helpful. And that's where my specialty is kind of bridging those two, the psychology and the spirituality. I guess you could call it spiritual psychology. I talk about the psychoenergetics of phenomena, and this kind of genre is what I've identified as ethical self help, which I will circle back to at the end of this episode to talk a little bit about what that means to me. But this ebook on self love, and then the other ebooks that I plan to release in the Demystifying series, the one that I'm working on right now is Demystifying the Inner Child. And so this is part of that genre of ethical self help where I deconstruct these trends through the lens of psychological theory and spiritual philosophy. So that's a little bit of an intro about my book. And if that sounds like it's right up your alley, check it out. I will link it in the show notes. So let's start just by defining what self help is. So, self help refers to a broad category of materials and practices and strategies that individuals use to improve various aspects of their lives, to enhance personal well being, and achieve specific goals. Self help covers a wide range of topics from personal development and mental health to relationships, career advancement, and overall lifestyle improvement. Self help is largely based on pop psychology, which borrows concepts from cognitive behavior therapy and positive psychology and other psychological theories and practices to make them more accessible and palatable to the general public, often at the cost of oversimplifying, misrepresenting, or distorting information, distorting, these complex psychological theories for entertainment or mass consumption. And I will give you an example of this that everybody listening to this podcast episode is probably familiar with, even if you've never gone into the self-help industry. You probably have heard of mindset theories, growth mindset. Okay. So this is a very good example of how self-help kind of uses psychological theories and makes them palatable to the general public and to where they become distorted. So mindset development, specifically growth mindset, was coined by Carol Dweck, who's a psychologist in the 80s. And I'll just briefly talk about this. This is just a side note, but I think it's a really, really good example. So she created like a series. She did a series of studies with school children where she gave them various tasks ranging from easy to more challenging. And she found that those children who had a growth mindset were more likely to take on more challenging tasks even after they failed the easy ones because they had learning goals. And the reason why they had learning goals is because of the type of reinforcement that they received from the adults, where the adults told them, "Great job. You must have worked so hard on that." On the flip side were the children who were given tasks and they actually were less likely to take on more challenging tasks after failing because they had performance goals that were reinforced through adults telling them, "Wow, great job. You must be so smart." Okay, so the children who wanted the harder tasks even after failing, they just focused on learning and growth, and they didn't internalize those failures as something that is wrong with them because they were relayed the message that it's through your hard work that you're able to accomplish the tasks. Whereas those children who were told, "Wow, you're so smart," internalized any failure as something that has to do with an inadequacy within themselves. So they were less likely to take on the harder tasks because they didn't want to be confronted with their own sense of inadequacy and shame. Okay. So that was the study. And it was revolutionary at the time. Okay. It was pretty groundbreaking. And of course, the media picked it right up. Celebrities picked it right up. and it blew up. It like blew into this household name. And of course, the narrative was convenient to the American dream narrative of rugged individualism, where it's the hard work. It's hard work equals success. And all it comes down to is your mindset. So if you develop this positive growth mindset and you work hard, you will be successful. Of course, years later, this theory was challenged. It was largely debunked because people realized that, wait a minute, it's not that easy. It's not that simple. There's social and economic and institutional and cultural factors at play here, right? You can't just mindset your way out of poverty. And there's so many complex variables when it comes to children and their future achievements, including privilege and socioeconomic status and access, real variables. And by the time that it was debunked, which by the way, interestingly enough, Carol Dweck herself was like, guys, hold on. Like, let's not get too carried away with this. I'm not suggesting that mindset is the end all be all. Like, let's reel it back in, but it was too late. It became this monster, and it's still so prevalent in the self-help industry, the prevalent narrative that yes, you can pull yourself up through your mindset, um, which was, already the seed had been planted. So it wasn't that long ago, right? Like the 80s were not that long ago. So it's going to take a while for us to, as a collective, to sort of untangle ourselves from that mess. And yes, I will reiterate, like, mindset is important. It's very important. It doesn't diminish its importance. Is it the number one factor that's going to make or break your success? No. But again, this is the compelling narrative. And that's just one example of how, like I was saying, self help sort of oversimplifies and misrepresents or distorts these complex psychological theories for mass consumption. And the closer those narratives resonate with the American dream ideals of the bootstrap theory and toxic individualism, the more hype there's going to be around it, right? It's just a confirmation bias on a collective level. So this leads us into the next point, which is setting the context. So, the first step in any kind of deconstructing work that I do is always to set the socio political and the cultural context, because these trends don't just magically appear out of thin air, right? They are born out of beliefs and practices and ideologies of a certain zeitgeist, of a certain time period, and an era that is represented by cultural and social and scientific and intellectual and artistic climate of that time period. And that captures the dominant ideas, beliefs, attitudes, trends that shape that particular era and then the eras that follow. So it's really important to have this zoomed out perspective, because otherwise you're just like lost in the sauce of social and cultural influences without having a grounding of the root. Because once you get to the root, then you can start identifying common themes along that thread that I was talking about. So, this is how I do the deconstructing work. When I pick a certain concept, like narrowing down the trend within the trend, for example, what I did with self love. So, I dive deep into that trend and then I follow the common thread, and I see then how it's reflected in the collective, in our society, in our social institutions, in our relationships, And that's how you can sort of start to see the forest for the trees, and recognize how similar patterns and themes emerge within your own life and your own experience of reality. And that is part of that deconditioning work, right? Out of the matrix. So, what are the themes here? What are the common things? Well, one of the biggest theme that runs through self-help and, every single trend within the self-help trend is late capitalism, religious fundamentalism, and patriarchy. Let's deconstruct that. When it comes to our modern and our conventional understanding of self help, this is largely credited to Samuel Smiles, who was a British failed doctor and journalist. And he wrote the first self help book called Self Help in 1859. And the opening lines of the book was, "Heaven helps those who help themselves." Okay? You cannot talk about capitalism without some religious fundamentalism, some white Christian nationalism, which is all tied to the patriarchy. And if you want to go all the way back, which I'm not going to do in this episode, I've talked about it so much on my social media posts, and I talk about it also in the book Manifest Destiny, the mental hygiene movement of the progressive era. These were all deeply associated with white supremacy, eugenics, this obsession with purity, and this idea that, diseases of the mind can be, and physical ailments as well, they can all be overcome by the will of God. And if you just worked hard enough and prayed and practiced your positive thinking, um, you're going to be fine. You're going to be healthy, wealthy, successful. And of course, this is a subtle form of victim blaming because it assumes that it is the individual person's fault that an illness is in their life, or if they're broke. And in fact, the framing is kind of like, ew, these people are contagious and you should stay away from them so, they don't infect you with their bad vibes. So Samuel Smiles writes this international bestseller where, he reiterates that hard work and self-discipline are the keys to success. And this inspires countless spin-offs of other white men at the time, doing their own rags to riches story. And these books would wind up in the hands of the global elite, who were already like pretty big business tycoons like Toyota, like Henry Ford. And then, of course, later there was Dale Carnegie, How to Win Friends and Influence People, Napoleon Hill, Think and Grow Rich. So each time there was like another rendition, another version of the original self help book, there was a new audience to absorb this mix, this special mix, this blend of capitalism and religion and pseudoscience. So, self help is basically capitalist propaganda. And I have a really great podcast episode with Rachel K. Albers on the cult of capitalism, where we go deeper into this. But in cult education language, this kind of propaganda is a form of mind control. And we have people like Tony Robbins and Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk, all now telling their own version of the rags to riches story about being self-made bajillionaires. And we know now that you don't get to be a bajillionaire in our society by thinking positive thoughts and even by working hard. There is the myth of meritocracy, right? What it takes to become a billionaire, a bajillionaire, is definitely not how many self help books you've read. It is how much you've been able to game the system, exploit, and extract from the world at the cost of everything else around you. I don't really consider myself anti capitalist in that sense. Like, I'm still learning about it. So I'm not adopting that label. But I do have a problem with people just not being honest. Okay. I don't have a problem. I do have a problem with billionaires. I just think it's so excessive. But those people who just want to focus on their life, their money, their dreams. I mean, do I live my life like that? No. Do I judge them? No. But I do strongly oppose the myths, the misconceptions, the deception, the misleading, because again, that is a cult dynamic. And that is a form of mind control and misinformation. And it has a net negative impact on society. Yeah, I have in my notes here that it's a form of gaslighting. I don't know if I really need to go into that. We just talked about it. It's this sense of like, no, actually, it is really important because the gaslighting element comes in when people start to really um, number one, they internalize the failures and the injustices that are happening as their fault, which is a really convenient way for the people who are doing the exploiting and the doing the abuse to get away with it and not be held accountable. Um, it's like, you know, it's like abusing a child and then promising them that they'll get rewarded for putting up with the abuse because that abuse is going to make them stronger. And then once they become strong enough, they'll be able to escape the abuse. I mean, what happens over time is that they just end up tolerating more and more of mistreatment and injustice while nothing in the external reality actually changes, while also thinking that it's about to change, right? It's right around the corner. We just have to believe. We just have to believe in our worthiness and the will of God. I mean, yeah, that is gaslighting. And the really, really like sick aspect of that is that we know, I mean, research shows that it's the people who are struggling the most that gravitate towards this like self help stuff, because they're already struggling. They are, socially marginalized, immigrants, people who really do believe in the American dream and they buy into the illusion that their next big break is just around the corner. So they put up with it. They put up with the abuse because they're promised big rewards later. So that really breaks my heart and that's not right. um and then people like to bring up like these token, like Oprah, for example. Don't even get me started on that. Yes, there are people who do escape from this cycle of abuse, but they are the exception, not the rule. Again, thinking that one individual person is going to represent the entire collective is a very hyper individualistic way of looking at the world. And that's what we have to try to break out of, as hard as it is. We got to consider the collective net impact on society as a whole. This level of industry wide, mainstream kind of gaslighting is a very effective way that capitalism keeps vulnerable people sick and broke and too exhausted to do anything about it because they are exploited and worked to death. So it is very cannibalistic. And, these, like I said, like if you want to do your own thing and reach a level of success that you want for yourself, okay. But these self-help or self-help adjacent life coaches and these manifestation babes that completely ignore this aspect of reality that is based on history and science, um, you know, and they just continue to perpetuate the myth of the self-made millionaire. This is a form of cult indoctrination, and some people are just not aware of it because they themselves have been influenced by this mind disease of self-help, and others do know and they are told and they just choose to ignore it and be willfully ignorant of it, which this is what I find disgusting. So that is sort of the context of self-help. And I want to ask, I want to ask you to consider, how does this affect us on an individual level? Even those who are privileged are negatively impacted by it. For example, me, like I consider myself privileged. I didn't go into self-help because I wanted to be rich. I went into it because I was really drawn to these ideas of, finding my purpose and fulfilling my potential, because I genuinely struggled in these areas. And I really did internalize that belief that there was some purpose for me in this world, and I didn't know what the purpose was, and it caused me a lot of like anxiety and this existential sort of dread that my life was going to be meaningless if I didn't find this purpose. And I think this part of it is very specific to the millennial generation, because of the way that self-help converged with social media, and within the context of the self-esteem craze that happened in the 80s and 90s that I'm not going to get into, but it's another trend within the trend that I talk about in my Demystifying Self-Love ebook. To answer that question, or to at least approach the question of what kind of impact is this having on our individual level, well, one of the things that makes self-help culty and impact us in a negative way is hyper individualism, toxic individualism. And toxic individualism, it refers to an extreme form of individualism that emphasizes personal success and self-reliance and autonomy, often at the cost of social responsibility and community and collective cooperation. It is a mindset that places an excessive focus on individual achievement and self interest, which is often at the cost of disregarding the well being of others or the broader social context. So it's not a matter of, mm, or critiquing individualism means that we gotta go to the other extreme of collectivism. No, like either extreme is bad. um, and while individualism in moderation can certainly encourage, personal growth and empowerment, toxic individualism, which is where we are at as a society, it's how we practice individualism, is in this very toxic and extreme way. It leads to negative consequences on both societies and both individuals and society. And there's a few ways that this manifests in the self-help industry as a cult dynamic. And one of them is this zealous, almost religious devotion to the idea of personal success as the ultimate goal. And on the flip side of that is the belief that personal failures are solely the individual's fault, right? Which again, this disregards real systemic, social, and cultural factors like that mindset example that I brought up earlier. And in turn, this leads to self blame and guilt and internalizing of failure, which then the self help industry preys upon to sell even more products and services. I call this the self help cycle of doom, or the self hell cycle of doom. And what this cycle does is it pathologizes normal human conditions and it normalizes pathological behaviors. So I'm going to detour a little bit. Let's take a little detour from the toxic individualism conversation to unpack this cycle of doom a little bit. So, the self help industry operates by identifying or inventing individual problems and then presenting solutions to them. And it does this through capitalizing on individuals' insecurities and vulnerabilities. Most prominently, that I've noticed, is the fear of death and the fear of loneliness. And it does this in a variety of ways. One of the ways is more through mortality salience, which it's our awareness of the inevitability of our own death. Um, Tony Robbins loves to trigger the mortality salience. Phrases like, "Imagine if you're on your deathbed, are you gonna look back in your life and feel proud and accomplished?" Or imagine if this was the last day of your life. Or near death experiences. People need these like these extreme near death experiences to really appreciate what they have. Like all of these, like it just triggers that awareness that we have of our own mortality, of our inevitable death. And this causes that existential dread and that anxiety in us, right? And of course, not every single person is going to feel this equally, but I felt it very strongly. And I know I'm not alone in that. And this translates over to, what if I'm not living my purpose? Okay. And this is very normal. Okay. This is our human quest. Okay. In positive and existential psychology, this is a very normal thing for people to have this existential quest for meaning and their purpose, and also the anxieties and the insecurities and the fears and the inadequacies that accompany that existential dread. These are also normal. But what self help does is it magnifies these common human challenges and it labels them as inadequacies or deficiencies, which is a way of pathologizing our normal human condition. This idea that if you have a soul sucking corporate job, you're not fulfilling your potential. If you don't travel the world, you're not fulfilling your potential. If you're not meditating daily, doing yoga, et cetera, like all the things that you're not doing causes FOMO. And here's like the nuance in that. It's not saying that meditation or yoga or these things are not helpful and that you shouldn't do them or you shouldn't rely on them as tools for coping with difficult points in your life, right? It's not the tool itself. It's the way that they say, if you don't do that, it's the framing of, if you're not doing these things, you have a problem. That's why you are poor. That's why you're broke. That's why you're struggling. That's why you have depression and anxiety, right? Because you're not doing these things. Like, you see that there's a nuance in the framing of that I think is really important, because it makes all the difference between, I'm doing this practice because it helps me, versus I'm doing this practice because I'm scared not to do it. And that's what creates the dependence. Another thing that the self help industry does, relatedly, is that it frames our everyday struggles as these significant obstacles that require external solutions, right? Like, you should love your job If you don't love your job, there's something really wrong. You're not living your purpose. You should wake up every day feeling excited about your life. Making money should be easy. And if you're not, you're doing something wrong. You should love yourself because no one else will love you. All of these, like, if it triggers feelings of fear of loneliness and fear of death. And like I said, this creates this cycle of dependency to keep us focused on our shortcomings so that we continue buying and consuming. And there's always a barrage of new, like, techniques and practices that promise to solve the new problems, right? So it's like we find this solution where we feel hopeful, like, and this is why you hear this all the time, and it's what happened to me. And I still hear people say, I've consumed so much self-help literature, I've read every single book under the sun, and I'm still experiencing those same problems. Number one, that could be because these are not problems in the first place. They're just like normal human struggles, like, welcome to just life. Or number two, it's because you're in this cycle of doom. You're in this cycle of dependency where you are seeking something in that book to feel good. And when we do read that, we do feel good. We get this rush of, like, dopamine, right? Because we're reminded of our greatness and our limitless potential. And then we hear anecdotes and stories of people who are just like us, who are able to do these amazing things, and we see ourselves in them. And then we're told that it's possible for us. And these solutions are often framed in this very, like, quick fix way where we are receiving this positive reinforcement or comfort, and it scratches some itch for, like, instant gratification that we have. And the promise of rapid transformation, of effortless change, ooh, it's just so appealing that it actually releases dopamine. I'll link a YouTube documentary that talks a little bit about this, but it actually releases dopamine. And then we come out of that experience, feeling elated, feeling euphoric. But of course, it does not translate over to the complexity of life because it's never a quick fix, it's never a rapid transformation. And then we feel disappointed and, again, very helpless and lost. And then we re-enter the self-love industry in order to solve these new problems, because, like I said, there's always some new thing. Like, if it's not your strategy, it's your energy. If it's not your energy, it's your childhood traumas. If it's not that, it's your victim mindset, and you've been doing it all wrong. I mean, it's literally never ending. It is a cycle of doom. It is a hell, a special kind of hell inside your own head. I've been there. 10 out of 10. Don't recommend. Okay, so I mentioned a few of the culty aspects of self-help related to individualism. So just to, like, put a bow on it, three things: the zealous devotion to personal success, the disregard for systemic or external factors, and then the internalized guilt and blame for failure. And these are all cult tactics that are meant to control a person's experience of reality, where their reality is being filtered through these beliefs and through these ideas that are not grounded in actual reality. So they don't actually help you, right? And I think this is what makes self help very culty. Well, there's a lot of things that make it culty, but this one thing that is a little bit less obvious is the aspirational aspect of it. I talked about this a little bit in my Instagram. So it targets our aspirations, right? Our desires, our ambitions, our goals and dreams. But beyond that, beyond these aspirational values for ourselves, there's always an appeal. This is what makes it very culty, is that there's always an appeal for a higher purpose for the collective. There's some transcendental mission there. So we're not just helping ourselves for ourselves, we're doing it to make the world a better place. Because when we work on ourselves, right, this is, again, toxic individualism. When we work on ourselves, we help others, and then we can extend that help to others, and it creates this ripple effect. It sounds really nice. I know it sounds so beautiful in theory, but this is a cult dynamic. Cults love to have this altruistic facade. This is how they gain trust and admiration, which makes it easier to manipulate people into compliance. And it's especially appealing for people like me, who didn't like had like lacked that sense of purpose, didn't have a clear sense of purpose, and they were searching for a direction in their lives. And this is how cults get you. And this is how they get you to prioritize the cult's mission over your own by saying that you're doing this, you're following this certain dogma for a mission that is much bigger than you. So, in recording this episode, I realized that I am already 53 minutes in, and I am pretty adamant about capping my episodes at 60 minutes because I personally have a really hard time listening to episodes that are longer than an hour. I had a whole section here that I wanted to talk about around how self help enables learned selfishness through toxic individualism by exploiting our biases. And one of those biases is the egocentricity bias, which belies the main character syndrome. Okay, I know I just said a lot of words there, and we're already like almost 60 minutes in. So it's okay if you're like, what? Wait, don't worry, there is going to be a part two. I'm glad because, yeah, I do have a lot to say clearly. So there's going to be a part two. And right now, I just want to wrap it up by just talking a little bit about what's beyond. Like, okay, so self help is trash. We hate the industry. Now, what do we do about it? Right. And that's where this idea of ethical self help comes in, and it's really embracing authentic paths to growth, which luckily they do exist, of course. And I have a few pieces of advice for you if you are kind of in that place of, okay, where do I go next? If not self-help, then what is it? um, yeah, I think it is very important. Okay, I just want to say that, like, I'm trashing the industry, okay, but self-help itself is very important. It is a part of having an internal locus of control, of taking ownership and responsibility for yourself and the direction that you want your life to go and how you want to show up in the world. Okay, so this really comes down to knowing your values and then making conscious choices that are aligned with those values. Because if you are making choices that are not aligned with those values, then you are deceiving yourself and you are deceiving others, because that's just not authentic, right? Then it becomes a performance. And I think a lot of these top dog self-help industry gurus, they're performing. I don't buy it. I don't buy that they are as well, they're probably as rich as they say they are, but that we know that that's not, a correlation with real fulfillment and deep fulfillment and that authentic growth that we are all craving. I don't buy it. I really don't. And maybe I'll talk about this a little bit in the second episode, but there are so many instances where these top dog gurus, they get called out for all kinds of abuse, exploitation. They're all happy, and then they get a divorce, while for years they've been talking about how they've mastered marriage, and then you find out that actually they've been having a lot of problems within their marriage. They get divorced, or they're really happy. They write a book on like self-help, and then like years later they commit suicide or something. So it's like there's a lot of instances like that where it's clear that there's something missing here. And what we're not doing that, right? We are seeking authentic paths to growth. I do believe in ethical self-help, and I do believe that there is a way to navigate the labyrinth of self-development without like getting lost in the sauce of it all. And I do have a couple of pieces of advice. Actually, I have a lot of points here that I wanted to cover, but I'm going to give you the main ones now, to walk away with. So be discerning about the type of self help content that you are consuming, okay? Because there is such a thing as good self help and bad self help out there. And the good self help are the ones that do more evidence based techniques. They use evidence-based techniques from like cognitive behavior therapy or DBT, dialectical behavior therapy skills. So these are more focused on skills building. They have workbooks, right? And it's evidence based. So this kind of self-help is a form of, it's called bibliotherapy, where you use books to help you, to support you along your life through building skills. And a lot of these books, they validate the reader's life experience. They provide them with concrete techniques that help to navigate those experiences. Um, a couple ones off the top of my head: Adult Children of Emotionally Insecure Parents by Lindsay Gibson. She's a psychologist. There's also another one, Rethinking Positive Thinking, also written by a psychologist. So look for people in the actual practice, professionals, experts, real experts in the mental health industry. They oftentimes will write a kind of a pop version of what they found through their own research. So really look at who you're learning from. I think that's one of the most important things. Um, because I know, yeah, there is like real value in that, and real value in these books, um, where, if you can't access therapy because mental health care is expensive and inaccessible, I think there is a important role for such books. And like I said, it's called bibliotherapy. It's usually written by a credentialed therapist or other relevant professional. And the focus is mostly on the reader. The focus should be on the reader, not the author. Okay, they shouldn't bring up like, okay, anecdotal stories are fine, but it's not so much about them. It's more like, how are we going to help you? Not, I figured it all out, but how can I help you figure it out? And then there's the part of it, the part of self-help that is a little bit more esoteric. And I think there's also value in that as well, from different lineages and traditions and more indigenous practices. And that should also be ethical in terms of, sharing the wisdom without appropriating it. Do they give credit to where they found that where they found that information, where they learned that? Are they the wisdom keepers? Are they part of a lineage? Do they have permission to share it? Or, and if they don't, how are they sharing it? Are they gatekeeping? Like, there's so many things, like there's ways to look at it to see, are we actually paying respect to the keepers of that lineage? And if you are reading an esoteric book, can you go back to the source? Can you go find, if you are just on your own secret path, it should never stop with a book. You should be able to go to the source and learn from the source. So that's an important thing to keep in mind as well. And another just last piece of advice that I have is to focus on your relationships, like self-help. And I'll talk about this in the second part of the episode. The way that self-help is so self-focused is actually contributing to our loneliness epidemic. I also, like, we got to talk about this. because it's serious, and a lot of people are struggling with loneliness. So focusing on your relationships, focusing on um, community, and having a nice balance, because there is a study. I just recently read this study about how there is a balance between self-care and caring for others, and that balance is super important for mental health and for wellness. And self-help literature, it tends to just weigh in on that self without considering the community aspect of it and the relationships. Even though they talk about relationships, it's like it's not actually practical advice. So build communities of care, find yourself, um, you know, people around you, and relationships that give meaning to your life. Happiness is in our relationships. This is we also know this now. The number one factor of our life satisfaction after a certain income bracket, um, is happiness, is relationships. So focusing on your relationships, and just, yeah, not letting these self-help gurus like rob you of your joy. Don't let them push your pain points, and make you feel insecure and inadequate, like you're doing something wrong. You're not. I think life is not supposed to be easy breezy. So you can just be happy you're not a self-help guru, I guess. Because like I said, I don't think those people are all right. Um like, imagine building your entire reality around self-improvement because that's your job, and if you don't constantly improve yourself, then you're going to feel out of alignment with what you teach. So like, Jesus Christ, I can only imagine the hellish experience of like constantly feeling like you are trying to outcompete yourself. So at least we're not there, right? So that's it for today, for this episode. I hope this was helpful for you and that you gained something here. I'd love to know how it landed, what came up, if anything came up. Like I said, this is going to be part of a ongoing conversation, so we will keep talking about it. If there's any aspect of self-help that you would like for me to explore, just let me know. Shoot me a DM or email. And yeah, like, the ebook is a great resource for deeper exploration into some of the things that I talk about in this episode. So check out the show notes. There's lots of resources there, and I will see you next time. Thank you. Thanks so much for listening to this episode. If you enjoyed it, please make sure you're subscribed to this podcast, and if you share it on social media, don't forget to tag me at Seek with Sarah. For my ebooks, courses, or to work with me one-on-one, visit my website, seekwithsarah.com. I appreciate you hanging out with me. Thanks for pressing play. See you next time.